You know that moment when you realize the person you helped climb the ladder is now using it to step on your head? I'm talking about that sick feeling in your stomach when you discover that your kindness has been weaponized against you, that your generosity has been twisted into a tool for your own professional destruction. It's the kind of betrayal that makes you question everything you thought you knew about human nature, about workplace loyalty, about the basic decency that's supposed to exist between colleagues who share the same goals and challenges. Here's what nobody tells you about betrayal in the workplace. It doesn't happen overnight, and it rarely looks like the dramatic backstabbing you see in movies. Real betrayal is subtle, methodical, and often disguised as natural workplace evolution. It's the slow erosion of your professional identity, the gradual shift from being valued to being invisible, the systematic replacement of your contributions with someone else's narrative, and the most insidious part, you're often the last person to recognize what's happening, because you're too busy being helpful, too focused on being a team player, too committed to believing that good work and good intentions will be enough to protect you. I learned this lesson the hard way at a small accounting firm in Burlington, where my decision to help a struggling new employee ultimately cost me everything I'd worked years to build. This isn't a story about dramatic office confrontations or obvious villainy. It's about something much more common and much more dangerous. The quiet betrayal that happens when your empathy becomes your weakness, when your willingness to lift others up is used as an opportunity to push you down. If you've ever felt invisible at work, if you've ever wondered why your contributions go unrecognized while others take credit for your efforts, if you've ever been made to feel like you're the problem when you're actually the solution, then this story is for you. The truth is, most of us will face some form of workplace betrayal during our careers. We'll encounter people who smile to our faces while undermining our positions behind our backs. We'll work alongside colleagues who view our kindness as weakness, and our generosity as an invitation to take advantage. The question isn't whether this will happen to you, but whether you'll recognize it when it does, and whether you'll have the tools to protect yourself and respond effectively. Because here's what I wish someone had told me before I gave away my desk to a stranger. Trust is earned, not freely given, and in the professional world, your survival often depends on understanding the difference between being helpful and being used. I still remember the morning Jake walked into our small accounting firm in downtown Burlington. It was one of those gray October mornings when the coffee seemed weaker than usual, and the fluorescent lights buzzed with that familiar hum that somehow made everything feel more mundane. I was sitting at my desk near the window, the one I claimed 3 years earlier when I first started working at Henderson & Associates. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, but it had become my sanctuary, my little corner of professional stability in a world that often felt uncertain. Jake stood there in the doorway, clutching a manila folder against his chest like it was a shield. His shirt was wrinkled, probably from sleeping restlessly the night before his first day, and there was something in his eyes that I recognized immediately. It was that particular blend of hope and terror that comes with starting over, with walking into a room full of strangers and pretending you belong. I'd seen that look in the mirror plenty of times during my own career journey, from the diner where I waitressed through college to the insurance company, where I'd learned the basics of office politics the hard way. The vulnerability was written all over his face, and something deep inside me responded to it with an almost maternal instinct. Our office manager, Patricia, was nowhere to be found that morning. She had this habit of disappearing whenever new employees arrived, leaving them to figure things out on their own, while she handled what she called more pressing matters. I watched Jake stand there for what felt like an eternity, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, clearly unsure of where to go or what to do next. The other employees bounced up from their computers, lost in their own worlds of spreadsheets and client files. It was in that moment that I made a decision that would change everything, though I had no way of knowing it at the time. I stood up from my desk and walked over to him, extending my hand with what I hoped was a welcoming smile. "You must be Jake," I said, remembering the brief introduction email Patricia had sent around the week before. "I'm Sarah. Looks like you could use a friendly face on your first day." The relief that washed over his features was immediate and profound. He shook my hand with the kind of gratitude that made me feel like I'd done something genuinely meaningful. I honestly wasn't sure if I was in the right place, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. This is all so new to me. What happened next was purely instinctive. I looked around the office and realized that no one had bothered to set up a proper workstation for Jake. There was a folding table in the corner, with a computer that looked like it had been retired from service years ago, and a plastic chair that had seen better days. It was the kind of setup that screamed temporary and not really important, the kind of arrangement that would make anyone feel like an afterthought. I couldn't let him start his new career sitting at that pathetic excuse for a desk, not when I remembered how it felt to be the new person trying to prove yourself worthy of respect and consideration. You know what? I said, surprising myself with my own boldness. Why don't you take my desk for now? I can set up over there temporarily while Patricia sorts out a proper station for you. The words came out before I could second-guess myself, driven by a combination of empathy and the memory of my own difficult beginnings. Jake's eyes widened in disbelief, and for a moment I thought he might actually refuse the offer. But then he nodded slowly, and I could see the gratitude mixing with something else in his expression, something that looked almost like respect. Are you sure? He asked, and I waved off his concern with a confidence I didn't entirely feel. Looking back now, I realized that moment was the beginning of everything that would follow. As I gathered my personal items from the desk, my coffee mug with the faded logo from my college bookstore, the small succulent my sister had given me for my birthday, the framed photo of my parents from their last vacation before Dad got sick, I felt a strange mixture of pride and apprehension. The other employees had started to notice what was happening, and I could feel their eyes on me as I made the transition. Some looked puzzled, others seemed mildly amused, but no one said anything. It was as if they were watching some kind of social experiment unfold, curious to see how it would play out, but unwilling to get involved themselves. The change didn't happen overnight, but looking back, I can pinpoint the exact moment when everything shifted. It was about 3 weeks after Jake had settled into my old desk, and I was still working from the makeshift station near the supply closet. I had grown accustomed to the sound of the copy machine humming behind me, and the constant interruptions from colleagues who needed to grab paper or toner cartridges. What I hadn't expected was how invisible this new location would make me feel, like I had voluntarily demoted myself to the periphery of office life, without anyone bothering to notice or care. Jake had started to find his rhythm at work, and with it came a confidence that I found both admirable and slightly unsettling. He no longer approached me with questions about the filing system or requests for help navigating the company's ancient computer network. Instead, I began to notice him gravitating toward the group of employees who gathered each morning near the coffee machine, the same people who had always made me feel like an outsider. There was Linda from payroll, who had a talent for making cutting remarks disguised as helpful suggestions. There was Mike from client services, whose jokes often came at someone else's expense. And there was Jennifer from human resources, who seemed to collect office gossip like some people collect stamps. I first noticed the shift on a Tuesday morning when I arrived a few minutes late due to a traffic jam on Route 2. As I hurried past the coffee station toward my corner near the supply closet, I heard the familiar sound of their laughter echoing through the office. But there was something different about it this time, something that made me pause and listen more carefully. Jake's voice rose above the others, animated and confident in a way I'd never heard before. He was telling some story about a client interaction, embellishing the details for comedic effect, and the group was eating it up. The same group that had always treated me like I was some kind of office furniture, barely acknowledging my presence unless they needed something. What struck me most was how natural he seemed with them, how easily he had slipped into their dynamic. It was as if he had always belonged to their inner circle, as if the weeks of quiet gratitude and shy smiles in my direction had been nothing more than a temporary phase. I found myself lingering by the supply closet, pretending to organize some files while I tried to process what I was witnessing. This was the same man who had looked so lost and grateful on his first day, the same person who had thanked me repeatedly for my kindness and generosity. Now, He was holding court with the office's unofficial social committee, and I was just another face in the background. The transformation became more pronounced over the following weeks. Jake would walk past my corner workstation each morning on his way to join the coffee crowd, and our interactions became increasingly brief and perfunctory. Where once he had stopped to chat about weekend plans or share a funny story about his commute, now he would offer nothing more than a quick nod or a distracted morning as he hurried past. I told myself that this was natural, that he was simply becoming more comfortable in his new environment and didn't need my guidance anymore. But there was something about the way he avoided eye contact that suggested it was more complicated than that. The breaking point came during a particularly busy Thursday afternoon when I was struggling to manage a complex client audit from my cramped corner station. The fluorescent light above my makeshift desk kept flickering, casting intermittent shadows across my work, and I was having trouble concentrating on the spreadsheets in front of me. I had been working on this particular project for weeks, and I knew I was close to identifying the discrepancies that had been troubling our client. Just as I was beginning to make some real progress, I heard Jake's voice rising above the general office chatter, and what I heard made my blood run cold. He was talking to Linda and Mike near the printer, their voices low, but not quite low enough to escape my notice. "Some people just don't know how to adapt to change," Jake was saying, and I could hear the smugness in his tone. "They get comfortable in their little routines and then act surprised when the world moves on without them." Linda laughed, that sharp, cutting sound that always made me cringe. "Oh, I know exactly what you mean," she replied. "There are definitely people around here who think they're irreplaceable, but they're really just, well, let's just say they're not exactly team players." The implication was clear, and the timing was too coincidental to ignore. They were talking about me. The erosion of my place in the office happened so gradually that I almost didn't notice it at first. It was like watching paint fade in the sun, where you don't realize how much color has been lost until you compare it to how vibrant it used to be. What started as Jake's natural integration into the office social structure slowly morphed into something more sinister, a systematic exclusion that seemed to involve everyone except me. The most painful part wasn't the obvious snubs or deliberate insults, but rather the way I began to disappear from the everyday fabric of workplace life, as if I had never really been there at all. The first major incident happened during what should have been a routine team meeting about the upcoming quarterly review. I had been working on the preliminary reports for weeks, staying late to ensure that all the numbers were accurate and the presentations were polished. It was the kind of detail-oriented work that I had always prided myself on, the behind-the-scenes effort that kept our small firm running smoothly, even when clients became demanding or deadlines grew tight. I had scheduled the meeting for Tuesday afternoon, sent out calendar invites to the entire team, and even arranged for Patricia to order sandwiches from the deli down the street. Everything was set, and I felt confident that my preparation would be recognized and appreciated. Tuesday afternoon came and went, and I sat in the conference room alone, watching the clock tick past the designated meeting time. At first, I assumed there had been some kind of miscommunication, maybe a technical glitch with the calendar system, or an urgent client issue that had pulled everyone away. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, I began to suspect that something more deliberate was happening. I walked around the office, checking to see if the others were dealing with some kind of emergency, but what I found made my stomach drop. The entire team was gathered in Jake's corner of the office, my former corner, huddled around his computer, and discussing the very reports I had been preparing for weeks. When I approached the group, the conversation stopped abruptly, and everyone turned to look at me with expressions that ranged from mild embarrassment to barely concealed annoyance. "Oh, Sarah," Linda said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We decided to move the meeting to this afternoon instead. Didn't you get the message?" But there had been no message, no phone call, no email, no updated calendar invite. I stood there, feeling the weight of their collective gaze, trying to process what was happening. Jake, sitting in my old chair at my old desk, looked up at me with something that might have been pity, or might have been satisfaction. "We figured you were too busy with your other projects," he said, gesturing vaguely toward my supply closet workstation. We didn't want to interrupt your workflow. The lie was so transparent that it was almost insulting. I had been working on nothing but the quarterly review for the past 2 weeks, and everyone in the office knew it. But standing there in front of the group, I felt powerless to challenge their version of events. It was as if they had collectively decided to rewrite reality, and I was expected to go along with it or be labeled as difficult and confrontational. I mumbled something about understanding and retreated to my corner, where I spent the rest of the afternoon staring at my computer screen and trying to make sense of what had just happened. The betrayal wasn't just personal anymore. It was professional, and it was threatening to undermine everything I had worked so hard to build. Over the following weeks, the pattern repeated itself with increasing frequency and boldness. Emails about important client updates somehow failed to reach my inbox, while Jake was copied on everything and often asked to take the lead on projects I had initiated. Lunch invitations were extended to everyone except me, and when I occasionally tried to join the group at the local sandwich shop, the conversation would shift to inside jokes and shared experiences that deliberately excluded me. It was psychological warfare disguised as workplace politics, and the most insidious part was how normal everyone pretended it was. If I complained or pointed out the obvious exclusion, I would be labeled as paranoid or overly sensitive. If I stayed quiet and endured it, the behavior would continue and escalate. The breaking point came when I discovered that my name had been removed from the company directory, without any explanation or advance notice. I found out by accident when a client called the main number looking for me, and was told that no one by that name worked at the firm. The client, confused and slightly irritated, called my direct line and asked if I had been let go or transferred to another department. I assured him that I was still very much employed and working on his account, but the conversation left me feeling shaken and uncertain about my own professional identity. When I approached Patricia about the directory issue, she seemed genuinely surprised and claimed it must have been an administrative error. But when I asked Jake about it later, he just shrugged and said he hadn't noticed anything unusual. The final insult came when I realized that Jake had been given access to my client files and was slowly taking over the relationships I had spent years building. He would schedule meetings with my longtime clients, present reports based on my research, and accept credit for solutions I had developed. The most painful part was watching him charm these clients with the same combination of vulnerability and gratitude that had initially drawn me to help him. He would mention how challenging it was to take over such complex accounts, how much he appreciated the opportunity to work with such important clients, and how committed he was to maintaining the high standards they had come to expect. The clients, impressed by his apparent dedication and fresh perspective, began to request him specifically for their projects, and I found myself relegated to a supporting role in my own professional relationships. There comes a moment in every betrayal when the accumulated weight of small humiliations becomes too heavy to carry in silence. For me, that moment arrived on a grey March morning when the snow was melting into dirty puddles in the parking lot, and the office felt more suffocating than usual. I had been enduring the systematic erosion of my professional identity for months, telling myself that things would eventually return to normal, that this was just a temporary phase in the office dynamics. But silence, I was learning, has its own gravity, and the longer I remained quiet about what was happening, the more I seemed to disappear from the collective consciousness of my workplace. The breaking point came during what should have been a routine interaction with a new intern named Emma. She was a bright college student majoring in business administration, eager to learn and genuinely excited about getting real-world experience in our small firm. I had been looking forward to mentoring her, remembering how much I had valued guidance during my own early career experiences. But when Emma approached my workstation near the supply closet, her question caught me completely off guard and shattered whatever remaining illusions I had about my status in the office. "Excuse me," she said politely. "Are you part of the administrative support team, or do you work in one of the other departments?" The question hung in the air between us, and I felt something inside me crack. Here was someone who had been in the office for 2 weeks, who had presumably been introduced to the various team members and shown around the different departments, and she genuinely didn't know what I did, or where I fit in the organizational structure. I had been working at this firm for over 3 years, had handled some of our most complex client accounts, had trained new employees and covered for colleagues during busy periods. Yet to this intern, I was just another face in the background, someone whose role was so unclear that she couldn't even categorize me properly. "I'm actually a senior associate," I managed to say, my voice sounding strange and distant even to my own ears. "I work on client accounts and financial analysis." Emma's confusion was genuine and heartbreaking. She looked around at my makeshift workstation, taking in the folding table, the outdated computer, the boxes of office supplies that surrounded me like a fortress of mediocrity. Then she glanced toward the main office area, where Jake sat at what had once been my desk, surrounded by the tools and resources that came with being taken seriously as a professional. "Oh," she said, clearly trying to process this information. "I'm sorry, I just assumed ... I mean, Jake mentioned that he was one of the senior associates, and Linda said that the main client work was handled by the team leaders." The implication was clear. If I was really a senior associate, why was I sitting in what looked like a storage closet while Jake occupied the prime real estate? That afternoon, I overheard a conversation that would haunt me for weeks. I was organizing files in the supply closet when Jake and Mike began talking just outside the door, their voices carrying clearly through the thin walls. "I don't know why she's still here," Jake was saying, his tone casual and dismissive. "I mean, she barely participates in meetings, doesn't seem to have any real client relationships anymore, and honestly, she just brings down the energy of the whole office." Mike laughed, that harsh sound that always made me cringe. "Some people just can't handle change," he replied. "They get comfortable in their little routines and then act all confused when the world moves on without them." What hurt most wasn't the cruelty of their words, but the casual way they dismissed everything I had contributed to the firm. They were talking about me as if I was some kind of dead weight, a relic from a previous era who had outlived her usefulness. The man who had once thanked me for my generosity and kindness was now discussing my professional demise with the same detachment. He might used to talk about replacing an old piece of office equipment. I stood there in the supply closet, surrounded by boxes of paper and printer cartridges, feeling like I was witnessing my own professional funeral. The most devastating part was the realization that they might be right, that I had become exactly what they said I was. The final straw came during a performance review meeting that felt more like a bureaucratic formality than a genuine evaluation of my work. Patricia sat across from me at the conference table, flipping through a file that seemed surprisingly thin for someone who had been with the company for 3 years. "Sarah," she began, her voice taking on the artificially sympathetic tone that supervisors use when they're about to deliver bad news, "we need to talk about your engagement level and your overall contribution to the team dynamic." The words engagement level and team dynamic were clearly code for something else. Euphemisms designed to make the conversation sound professional and constructive, rather than personal and devastating. As Patricia continued to outline my supposed deficiencies, I found myself thinking about the irony of the situation. Here I was, being criticized for not being engaged enough, for not contributing to the team dynamic, while sitting in a supply closet and being systematically excluded from the very activities that would have allowed me to demonstrate my engagement and contribution. It was like being criticized for not swimming while being held underwater, a psychological trap that made it impossible to succeed regardless of how hard I tried. The betrayal wasn't just personal anymore. It had become institutional, woven into the fabric of the organization itself in ways that made it seem natural and inevitable rather than deliberate and cruel. Making the decision to resign wasn't dramatic or impulsive. It was more like finally acknowledging something that had been true for months, but that I had been too proud or too afraid to admit. I spent a sleepless weekend in early April crafting my resignation letter, choosing each word carefully, trying to strike the right balance between professionalism and honesty. The cherry tree outside my apartment window was in full bloom, its pink petals falling like snow onto the sidewalk below, and I found myself thinking about renewal and fresh starts. By Sunday evening, I had printed the letter on my personal stationery, signed it with my best pen, and placed it in an envelope that felt heavier than it should have. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp spring air that usually filled me with optimism, but as I drove to the office, my hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel. The resignation letter sat in my purse like a loaded weapon, and I kept reaching over to touch the envelope, making sure it was still there. I had rehearsed the conversation with Patricia dozens of times in my head, imagining various scenarios and responses. Maybe she would express surprise and ask me to reconsider. Maybe she would want to discuss what could be done to address my concerns. Maybe she would recognize that the firm was losing a valuable employee and take steps to make things right. These hopeful fantasies sustained me through the morning, right up until the moment I actually sat down in Patricia's office. The conversation was shorter and more anticlimactic than I had expected. Patricia listened politely as I explained my decision, her expression remaining neutral and professional throughout. When I finished speaking, she was quiet for a long moment, studying the resignation letter I had placed on her desk. "Are you sure this is what you want to do, Sarah?" she asked finally, but there was something perfunctory about the question, as if it were required by some unwritten protocol rather than arising from genuine concern. "We'd hate to lose you, of course, but I understand that sometimes people need to explore new opportunities." The phrase, "new opportunities," hung in the air between us, a polite fiction that allowed both of us to pretend this was a voluntary career move, rather than an escape from an untenable situation. What struck me most was the absence of any real effort to understand why I was leaving, or to address the problems that had led to my decision. Patricia didn't ask about my experience with the team, didn't inquire about my workload or work environment, didn't even seem curious about whether there was anything the firm could do differently. It was as if my departure was not just acceptable, but perhaps even expected, a natural conclusion to a story that everyone else had already finished reading. "We'll need to arrange for a transition period," she continued, pulling out her calendar. 2 weeks should be sufficient to wrap up your current projects and brief someone else on your client relationships. The transition period was a masterclass in professional humiliation disguised as bureaucratic necessity. Jake, naturally, was designated as my replacement for most of my client accounts, and I was expected to train him on the very relationships and projects that he had already been slowly taking over. The irony was almost comical, if it hadn't been so painful. Here I was, explaining to Jake the intricacies of accounts he had been working on behind my back, sharing insights and strategies that he would soon claim as his own innovations. He sat at my old desk, taking notes on my old computer, nodding thoughtfully as I walked him through years of accumulated knowledge and relationship building. The whole process felt like attending my own professional funeral while being expected to deliver the eulogy. The most telling moment came during my last day, as I was packing up the few personal items I had accumulated at my supply closet workstation. The office felt strangely quiet, and I realized that no one had organized a farewell lunch, or even a casual goodbye gathering. In my previous jobs, departing employees had usually been honored with at least a sheet cake in the break room and a few words of appreciation from the management. But here, my departure was being treated like a routine administrative matter, something to be processed efficiently and forgotten quickly. Emma, the intern, stopped by to say goodbye, and her genuine sadness at my leaving was both touching and heartbreaking. "I was really hoping to learn more from you," she said quietly. "You're the only one who actually explained things instead of just giving orders." As I carried my box of personal belongings to the parking lot, I caught a glimpse of Jake through the office window. He was already settling into what would now officially be his permanent workstation, arranging his things in the space I had once called home. The afternoon sun was streaming through the window I had looked out of for 3 years, illuminating the desk where I had worked late countless evenings, the chair where I had sat through difficult client calls and challenging project deadlines. It all looked exactly the same, except that I was no longer part of the picture. The transition was so seamless that it was as if I had never been there at all. As if the past 3 years had been nothing more than a temporary arrangement that had finally reached its natural conclusion. The first week after leaving Henderson and Associates felt like recovering from surgery. There was relief, yes, but also a profound disorientation that came from suddenly having nowhere to go each morning. I found myself waking up at my usual time, reaching for clothes that were appropriate for an office I no longer worked in, mentally reviewing a schedule that no longer existed. The silence in my apartment was overwhelming after 3 years of fluorescent lighting and the constant hum of office equipment. I wandered from room to room like a ghost, carrying my coffee mug and wondering what people do with themselves when they're not being systematically undermined by colleagues they once tried to help. The automated emails started arriving within hours of my official departure. Your access to the Henderson and Associates network has been revoked. Read the first one, sent at exactly 5:01 p.m. on my last day. Your company email account will be permanently deleted in 30 days. Please ensure that any personal files have been transferred to your personal accounts. The clinical language was somehow more hurtful than any personal insult could have been. 3 years of client correspondence, project files, and professional relationships reduced to an automated deletion notice. No human being had bothered to call or send a personal message. I had simply been processed out of existence by the same impersonal systems that had processed me in on my first day. What hurt most during those early days was the deafening silence from the people I had worked alongside for years. I had expected at least a few colleagues to reach out, perhaps to express regret about how things had ended, or to wish me well in my future endeavors. But my phone remained stubbornly quiet, and my personal email inbox filled up with grocery store promotions and credit card offers, instead of messages from former co-workers. It was as if I had been erased not just from the company directory, but from the collective memory of everyone who had known me there. The isolation was so complete that I began to wonder if I had imagined the entire experience, if perhaps I had been delusional about my contributions and relationships all along. The worst part was the way doubt began to creep into my thoughts during those long, empty days. Sitting alone in my apartment, with nothing but time to analyze and reanalyze every interaction from the past few months, I started to question my own perceptions and judgments. Maybe Jake really had been more talented and deserving than I had given him credit for. Maybe my exclusion from meetings and projects had been based on legitimate performance concerns rather than politics and favoritism. Maybe I really had been the problem all along, too set in my ways to adapt to a changing workplace environment. The gaslighting that had begun in the office continued in my own mind, even without anyone there to reinforce the false narrative. The breakthrough came during a conversation with my college roommate, Rebecca, who drove up from Boston to check on me, after I had been uncharacteristically quiet on social media for several weeks. We were sitting in my kitchen, sharing a bottle of wine and catching up on each other's lives, when she asked me to tell her exactly what had happened at work. I started the story intending to give her a balanced perspective, acknowledging my own potential mistakes and shortcomings. But as I recounted the events chronologically, from Jake's first day to my final departure, Rebecca's expression grew increasingly angry and incredulous. "Sarah," she interrupted when I paused to take a sip of wine, "do you realize how insane this all sounds? You're describing systematic workplace harassment, and you're talking about it like it was your fault." Her reaction was like a bucket of cold water, shocking me out of the fog of self-doubt that had been clouding my judgment for months. "You gave this guy your desk on his first day," Rebecca continued, her voice rising with indignation, "and he repaid you by undermining your position and stealing your clients. That's not normal workplace competition, Sarah. That's betrayal. Plain and simple." Hearing the story reflected back to me through someone else's perspective helped me see it clearly for the first time. I hadn't been paranoid or oversensitive. I had been the victim of a calculated campaign to push me out of my own job. The relief of having my experience validated was overwhelming, and I found myself crying for the first time since I had left the office. The next morning, I woke up feeling lighter than I had in months. The doubt and self-recrimination were still there, but they had been joined by something stronger: clarity. I finally understood that my mistake hadn't been in trusting Jake, or in trying to help a new colleague find his footing. My mistake had been in believing that kindness and generosity would be recognized and reciprocated in a professional environment. I had operated under the assumption that doing good work and treating people well would be enough to secure my place in the organization. But I had learned the hard way that office politics often have very little to do with merit or character. It was a painful lesson, but an important one, and I knew it would serve me well in whatever came next. The lessons I learned from my experience at Henderson & Associates didn't come all at once, but rather revealed themselves slowly over the months that followed my departure. It took time to process the full scope of what had happened and to understand how I could protect myself from similar situations in the future. The most difficult part was accepting that my natural inclination toward generosity and helpfulness, traits that I had always considered strengths, had actually made me vulnerable to exploitation. Learning to maintain my compassionate nature while also establishing clear boundaries became one of the most challenging aspects of my personal and professional recovery. The first and most important lesson was about the difference between being helpful and being taken advantage of. I realized that I had consistently given away pieces of my professional identity without ensuring that my contributions were recognized or valued. When I gave Jake my desk, I hadn't asked for any acknowledgement of the sacrifice or any assurance that it would be temporary. When I trained him on our systems and procedures, I hadn't insisted that my role as his mentor be formally recognized. I had operated under the naive assumption that good deeds would speak for themselves, but I learned that in many professional environments, unacknowledged contributions simply become invisible, as if they never happened at all. Moving forward, I promised myself that I would never again give away my physical or professional space without clear agreements about expectations and duration. The desk incident had been a perfect example of how a temporary gesture of kindness could become a permanent loss if not properly structured. In my next job, I would ensure that any accommodations I made for new colleagues would be clearly defined as temporary measures with specific end dates. I would also insist that my contributions be formally acknowledged, whether through email confirmations, meeting minutes, or other documentation that would prevent my efforts from being forgotten or minimized later. The second major lesson involved recognizing the early warning signs of betrayal before they became entrenched patterns. Looking back, I could see that Jake's shift in behavior had begun much earlier than I had initially realized. The first time he laughed along with a joke at my expense should have been a red flag. The first meeting that happened without me should have prompted a direct conversation about communication and inclusion. Instead, I had made excuses for these incidents, telling myself that they were isolated occurrences or misunderstandings rather than parts of a larger pattern. In the future, I would trust my instincts more quickly and address concerning behavior before it had a chance to escalate. I also learned the importance of building and maintaining professional alliances before I needed them. During my time at Henderson & Associates, I had focused so intensely on my individual work and client relationships that I had failed to cultivate strong connections with colleagues who might have supported me when the political winds shifted. My isolation had made me an easy target, someone who could be marginalized without anyone noticing or caring enough to intervene. In my next position, I would make a conscious effort to build genuine relationships with a diverse group of colleagues, not for political reasons, but to create a network of mutual support and professional respect. Perhaps most importantly, I learned to recognize the difference between a workplace culture that valued collaboration and one that rewarded manipulation and backstabbing. The warning signs had been there from the beginning at Henderson & Associates. From Patricia's tendency to disappear when difficult situations arose to the established clique that seemed to take pleasure in excluding others. I had been so grateful to have a job and so focused on proving myself that I had ignored these red flags. In the future, I would pay much more attention to workplace culture during the interview process, asking specific questions about how conflicts were resolved, how new employees were integrated, and how contributions were recognized and rewarded. The final and most personal lesson was about the importance of maintaining my self-worth independent of external validation. I had allowed my professional identity to become so intertwined with my role at Henderson and Associates that when that role was undermined, I began to question my own value and competence. The months of self-doubt and second-guessing had been almost as damaging as the original betrayal itself. Moving forward, I would work to maintain a stronger sense of my own worth and capabilities, one that couldn't be shaken by office politics or the opinions of colleagues who might not have my best interests at heart. I would continue to be generous and helpful, but I would do so from a position of strength rather than insecurity, and I would never again allow someone else's lack of appreciation to diminish my understanding of my own professional value.